Hello, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 4:00 on the dot in Washington, D.C. If you can hear me, please type your city, state, country you're representing in the chat box. Hello, I see some, oh, Sister Joyce here. I see Jersey, California, New Hampshire, ATL. Hey, thanks for the shout out. Minneapolis, Las Vegas, Chicago, Oakland, be more. Listen, there's so many of y'all. Pittsburgh, Plymouth, Chile. Hello. Harlem, to be specific. We appreciate that. New Jersey, Cleveland. Yes. I expected there to be a lot of Cleveland or Ohio people in this session. California, Stone Mountain, Georgia. My folks are in Stone Mountain or around that area. Essex, England. I lived in London actually. I went to the University of London for a bit. West Indies. It's all the Alabama. Okay, I think we have y'all all here. This is excellent. I am really excited for this session. I know y'all are excited because I've been watching the chat and some of the emails and messages we received via social media. Let's get started. So, thank you for joining us for today's micro class. My name is Keisha Lee, and I'm the executive director for the Hurston-Wright Foundation. We are an arts organization that's devoted to increasing Black literary representation, and we do this via our annual writing awards and celebrations for Black writers and college students, and also via our workshops, craft talks, and also literary panels. In celebration of National Poetry Month and in collaboration with the English department at the Howard University, we are presenting this 2 day poetry series featuring none other than Hanif Abdurraqib, who you're all here to see today. And then tomorrow, same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Shayla Sabri will be teaching the microclass. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So today's session is meant to be a short micro learning opportunity. And you'll notice that your cameras and mics are turned off so that we can maximize our time with Hanif. We also have over 200 of you here, so we might be here all day if we had those items active. You're using the chat very well, so please continue to use this to celebrate, to share how you're feeling as the micro class is going on. The second point is that if you do have questions during the presentation for Hanif, please type them in the Ask a Question section that's at the bottom of your screen. And you can also vote up questions that you really want answered that other participants in this workshop type in the Ask a Question field. Hanif will answer them after his presentation or whenever the spirit so moves him. Finally, we will post some housekeeping notes in the chat periodically, including a link to materials that Hanif has provided for today's session. Did y'all get that poem, Single Ladies Beyonce? Um, and we'll also give you some additional information around how to stay engaged with the Hurston-Wright Foundation. I have some amazing team members, Natasha, Amina, Kaya, and Mac, who are also in the chat, who will help facilitate and make sure that if you have any questions about the foundation or need links to stuff, they'll post them over in the chat. So let's get started with why you're actually here this evening. Today's micro class is titled Translating Familiar Language by Hanif Abdurraqib. Hanif is a poet, essayist, and cultural critic from Columbus, Ohio, and he is the author of 2 collections of poetry and 1 essay collection. His first poetry collection was a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Book Prize and the Hurston-Wright Legacy Award. His first collection of essays, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, was named Book of the Year by Buzzfeed, NPR, and Oprah Magazine, among many others. And finally, if you've been following Hanif, you know that on a personal note, he makes beautiful bunt cakes. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should like immediately go to his Instagram and follow him. And it also just so happens that Hanif led the Hurston-Wright Writers Week poetry workshop last summer that we hosted at Howard University, also in conjunction with the English department. He was a crowd favorite, and I know that because I see some of his students and some of our writing participants are here today. So, hey, y'all. And I know that we're all in for something special. So, sit back, get ready, enjoy. I'm going to get off the screen. Thank you for coming to this session. And Hanif, over to you.
Hey everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And thank you all for being here and for taking the time out. Hurston-Wright's immensely important to me, and the work they do has been vital to my life and career as a writer. And so it was great to do this. I am going to, we don't have a ton of time together, which is rough because this is a topic that I can talk about for a long time. So it's going to be hard to maybe condense my thoughts. But the poem I sent was, I want to talk about translation, and I want to talk about kind of breaking ourselves free from the shame of familiar language or language that we love, right? Because I know that when I first started writing poems, I came to poems a lot later than other folks. And I came to poems through not academia, I came to poems through slam, so the performance of poems, and through speaking poems out loud, which meant that I came to poetry with a set of language that I knew was my language, that I knew sounded good coming out of my mouth, that I knew was musical to me. And so what that meant was there was a lot of shame around my using repetitive language in my work. And I kind of wanted to break that down and talk about different ways that we can use language to translate our own selves. So the first poem that I sent y'all, or the poem that y'all should have, is an E.J. Cole poem called Beyonce's Quadruple Platinum Single. I have like a couple of different monitors, and so I'll be like trying to be here, but I'll be looking at all of them too. The poem that you should have is E.J. Cole's Beyonce's Quadruple Platinum Single, where it's just simply an English to English translation of Single Ladies, the lyrics of Single Ladies. And why I put that in mostly was for the repetitive nature and the different ways that E.J. Cole arrives at that English to English translation of the repetitive nature of the lyrics. So be it all the single ladies, or if you like your shit, you should have put a ring on it. And how each time those words come around, she's like manipulating her own text to fit them. And an effective practice for me in my own writing has kind of been figuring out how to lean on both translation, like English to English translation of my own word, and how to kind of one, be my own thesaurus in a way, but also to produce as though I am relying on sampling. And so I want to read a Frederick Douglass quote that he gave when talking about, I know that bouncing from Beyonce to Frederick Douglass might be abrupt, but it's what we're going to do. I'm going to read a Frederick Douglass quote that he said when talking about the Underground Railroad and how music was translated along the Underground Railroad. A keen observer might have detected in our repeated singing of O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan, something more than a hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan. I thought I heard them say there were lions in the way. I don't expect to stay much longer here was a favorite and had a double meaning. In the lips of some, it meant the expectation of a speedy summons to a world of spirits. But in the lips of our company, it simply meant a speedy pilgrimage toward a free state and deliverance from all the evils and dangers of slavery. The meaning of the lyric changed depending on the way the voice held the words. And so that quote sticks with me always, because it reminds me that the way that even our most familiar language, or the language that we love, that we use all the time, the way that is bent or the way that is positioned next to other language, makes it different. That in and of itself makes it unique, right? I like to think about the poem as though the poem is kind of like tuning a guitar, you know? So each line has to have its own sonic quality, but that sonic quality has to serve the full body of the poem. But much like a guitar, a poem can have, in the language in a poem, can have alternate tunings. It can have as many tunings as necessary. And through that process, we are not necessarily relying on familiar language as much as we are sampling ourselves. And this works better in a classroom form where people can like respond immediately, but I don't know if we can do that really effectively in the chat. So I'm going to play some songs and some samples. I'm going to play an original song and then the song that samples it. And I would love for y'all to, as you hear these, to think about what different feelings are being evoked from each. And the first two I'm going to play are songs that sample gospel records. And I especially am invested in the choral nature of language, the way that multiple voices singing the same word almost shift the volume and power of the word. And so I'm going to play two samples of two albums that have two songs that have sampled gospel songs and slowed them down. And in the slowing of them down, you kind of hear a different type of language entirely. Let me turn my speakers down a little bit because I feel like I was in here vibing out earlier. So this first song is "Nobody Knows" by Pastor T.L. Barrett and the Youth for Christ Choir. And I'm gonna play it and jump directly into the sample. Forgive the second song. I couldn't get the instrumental of this song without DJ Khaled yelling over it, so we'll just have to deal with that. Can someone give like a thumbs up if you can hear it in the chat?
Another one. Young Money. Alicia Keys.
So that's one example of the slowing down of the gospel sample. Here's another. And so I play those as an example of how using something familiar and then making it different is simply trying to remanufacture or represent the way an ear hears language or hears sound, as opposed to moving away from words and putting words in a different order, changing the words you fall in love with. I'm going to put a poem in the chat, a poem by Terence Hayes, which is one of the American sonnets. And I'll read the poem out loud, but it's in the chat right now. And I picked this poem because of how it uses the word crow and how it plays with the word crow. And y'all should have it now. Okay. I think Oh, yeah, the poem is in there, so y'all can click on it and read along if you'd like, or follow along when you can. American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin. I lock you in an American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet, a little room and a house set aflame. I lock you in a form that is part music box, part meat grinder to separate the song of the bird from the bone. I lock your persona in a dream-inducing sleeper hold while your better selves watch from the bleachers. I make you both Jim and the Crow here. As the Crow, you undergo a beautiful catharsis trapped one night in the shadows of the gym. As the gym, the feel of crow shit dropping to your floors is not unlike the stars falling from the pep rally posters on your walls. I make you a box of darkness with a bird in its heart. Voltas of acoustics, instinct, and metaphor. It is not enough to love you. It is not enough to want you destroyed. I love this poem. I love, like many of you in the chat, I love Terrence Hayes as well. And I love the American Sonnets, but I mostly love this one and a few others in the book for what they do with similar language in small spaces. I love that this poem in particularly is playing with the idea of Jim Crow without saying Jim Crow, you know what I mean? Like without fully giving into that idea. And I think too, a part of what I mean when I talk about one, translating our own familiar language into and making it more useful in different forms, and about not being ashamed of the language we're using, is by finding new ways to present it and pull people away from the expected use of it, even ourselves, right? Like I think the editing process is often for me about pulling myself away from the familiar use in language. And so here's a prompt that I would love for y'all to take on if you can. And this is perhaps harder for some folks than others, but think about your 7 favorite words, just 7, if you got them. Words that you, and like peek back through your work, right? Think about words that you use a lot, words that you like using, words that you have maybe before in your work told yourself I shouldn't be using or that you're ashamed of using. And so think about your 7 favorite words, whatever favorite means to you. And mark out, so that's step 1. Step 2, write a 14-line poem, at least 14 lines. It could be shorter than 14 lines, but at least 7 lines and no more than 14. In your 14-line poem, you have to use one of those 7 words in every line, and that word has to appear in a different way. Another poem I'm going to put in the chat as an example, oh no, where did it go? Is a Luther Hughes poem that I love a great deal and helped publish when I was at Muzzle. This poem is called Chains. And I am going to, once they put all the instructions in, I'll put the poem in the chat. I don't want to like, there you go. So I'm putting this poem in the chat now too. This poem is a little longer, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read the first section. This is Chains by Luther Hughes. The pavement smell of black boys, write and rap black boys, bang blue against those black boys are sin. Write them sin boys, listen to sin boys, them sin boys whine like you used to, they church like you used to, denied Jesus like you did, front row pew boys, mama waits for you, mama say Jesus will save you, black boy, listen to that Jesus boy, write about them Jesus boys, nail yourself against that Jesus boy, stomach first, then nail, then palm. So what I love about this poem, and you'll see it as it goes on, is that a big way that Luther manipulates the repetitive nature of the language is by making the language plural, going from boy to boys to boy, going from black to blacks, and playing with multiplying the idea or the population of the people in the poem. And I encourage to there's something musical when I talked about how a poem is like tuning a guitar, what I mean is there's something musical about a percussive word like boy or like black or like pew or even like mama, a word with kind of like a heavy percussion element to it. And if you are someone who uses one of those words, a way that I think to use that language to your advantage is to repeat it, is to make it feel as though a reader is kind of pushing themselves against an onslaught of drums, right? An onslaught of drumming or an onslaught of percussion. And so when I think about words I love most, I think the words I love most for their musical qualities. And so it serves me to inject those into poems in heavy doses because they only serve to make the poem more musical. And I think we owe ourselves, or we owe our poems, we owe the language we use, the type of music. And we are very fortunate, I think, to be a people who, you know, put when some of our language is rubbed up against other language, it creates music. I learned Arabic before I learned English, though I don't know Arabic as well as I used to nearly at all. But Arabic was kind of the first thing, the first sound I heard, the first language that I felt connected to. And I don't know if anyone in the room knows Arabic, but Arabic is feels to me at least very inherently musical. And so I think that the most of my life I have been chasing music that feels sonically pleasing, or chasing words that feel sonically pleasing to try to replicate the first words I fell in love with. And so this Luther Hughes poem really moves me because it is taking this word boy and bending it in so many different ways, and making it so that every time it appears, it should be a surprise. So with the prompt that I gave, I want you to look at the Terence poem and look at the Luther poem in particular, and think about how these familiar words are returning in ways that surprise you or make you feel like you are seeing them for the first time. Because I think that for me has been the only thing that has shaken me free of the shame of, oh no, I'm writing that same word again, or I'm using that same image again, right? Or I'm relying on the same metaphor again. I don't want to steer people away from inventiveness, and I don't want to steer people away from evolution, but I also want to steer people towards a kind of joyful acceptance of the language they return to, because I think you're returning to that language for a reason. And so when we talk about translating ourselves, I like to think about the sample as a translation tool, right? If especially the vocal sample. And I know that I'm tying everything to hip hop in a way, but the way that, like, for example, Kanye West used Through the Wire back in 2004 or 5, where he sped it up and made it so that even though I knew that song, to hear that song was to know that song, but to hear it in that way was to know it differently, right? The words blended together, the words braided together until they created kind of like one, like Shaka Khan sounded like, I mean, it's a perfect example is that the song is Through the Fire and the Kanye West song is Through the Wire. And when that song bent that sample, the word fire got kind of distorted. So it sounded like wire, right? And so I like to think about ways that we can do that ourselves, distort our own language until it becomes something different and new. I'm gonna pop into questions now. There's 7. And folks can ask questions about like this stuff, ask questions about writing in general, ask questions about poems and other people's poems or whatever. Yeah. My favorite word. I'm gonna look at my favorite word. My favorite word. Oh gosh, my favorite English word is abundant. I like the word abundant because it feels to me like saying it out loud feels to me like what it is. And weirdly, like in my first book, I wrote this poem about the word moist. And I know that people don't generally like that word, and I get it. Like I don't, I'm not like big sad, but I like that word because I think the reason people don't like it, or one of the reasons I think people don't like it, is because it creates for me at least, it creates a sensation in the mouth like what it's describing. It feels very heavy and humid and thick and not comforting. But there's something I like about that. I like a word that that confronts you with its meaning. You know what I mean? I like a word that becomes itself as it leaves you. And so moist does that for me. I don't use that word in my work a lot, and I don't say it out loud a lot, but I'm fascinated by it in words like it that almost embody themselves as they leave the mouth. But it's not a word I use in my work. But I use the word abundant, or I say the word abundant out loud a lot. I love it. I don't know. It's also it was a word I think my mother used a lot, and so I think there's something there too. Another question. Is there a site or book that I can get that talks about words and how they relate to the sound of instruments? Well, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of, there's a lot of music theory books. One book that I want to suggest is, hold on, I'm gonna put it in the chat. Zong by Maurice Phillip is a book that is completely about sound and memory and history, but it's a perfect example, I think, of yeah. Shout out to that book. I love Zong. Zong taught me so much about sound in the way that words appear on a page, or letters even. Letters too can appear on a page and create music. And it never felt to me that was possible. Zong is weirdly one of the first books that I got. Like, Zong was one of the first books of poems that I got. And it was so terrifying to me as someone who wasn't really hip to poetry at the time, to see this book presented to me and think like, this is what poetry could do, because I felt so far away from it. And so I put it away. I mean, I got to look in like 2012 when I first started writing poems, and I very quickly was like, oh, no, that's not what I'm on. Like, I can't be on that. But as I revisited it 2 years later, and it really changed my life. And I'm gonna put another book in the chat, I think, if I can find it, about language as instrumentation. Oh, no, that's just like an article. I can send it out later. But Zong for sure. Get Zong. Who are some of your favorite music artists, inspirations, and how do they influence your writing? So I think I grew up on hip hop, and a big thing for me with hip hop was storytelling, which I know did not originate in hip hop, right? Like, I come from a long line of storytellers. My father is a storyteller. My elders are storytellers. Folks in my hood where I grew up were storytellers. And so there was a long lineage of storytellers presented to me at a young age. But there's a difference between living through a lineage of elders who are storytellers and seeing storytellers presented to you in a form of music that you love. And so I think my earliest inspiration was Slick Rick. And there was, because of how rich and vivid his stories were. Ice Cube was another one. These are all artists I shouldn't have been listening to at the age I found them, right? But I did nonetheless. Also MC Lyte. MC Lyte was another artist who was a storyteller that I really loved. And I think for me, being young and listening to hip hop, I learned how to craft narrative even before I knew that I was crafting narrative. Another genre that I grew up on, it's well documented, I grew up on the punk scene here in the Midwest, and so I grew up with punk. And there's this thing about punk that I'm fascinated by, where all the punk songs that I love the most do a lot of work sonically and lyrically in a small amount of time. And so they feel a little claustrophobic. And so I think for example, I love that Terrence Hayes poem, because it does so much work in a small space. It's a small poem that is kind of turning over a lot of things at once. And I aspire to that always. I am someone who is maybe too wordy when I speak out loud, but when I take to the page, I'm really eager to get in and get out and do as much as I possibly can in that small space. And I think punk music has influenced that, for better or worse. Sometimes worse, if I'm being honest with myself. How would you suggest we use other languages in poems so the reader doesn't feel excluded? So I'm not, that's a good question. I am someone who only writes in English. And so I don't know if I can effectively answer this well, or I don't know if I'm the person who should answer this, but I will say that broadly, so this isn't answering this question directly, but broadly, I am often asking myself the question of reader exclusion and who is served by that. Because, for example, there is maybe one poem I wrote Arabic in, right? And at the time, my thought was not who is being excluded by this. My thought was, I have people in my family who read Arabic more than they read English, and they will be included by this, or they will feel more held by seeing this in my work. You know, I think oftentimes I return to this central idea that the people I want to read my work are the people I grew up with and the people I grew up loving and the people from my neighborhood. And that feels very vital to me. And so to answer your question about reader exclusion, I think flipping that and considering reader inclusion has helped me a great deal. I heard that a song should answer a question. Does that go for poems? Who chooses the purpose of the poem, writer or reader? Oh, that's such a good question. I personally don't often attempt to answer questions when I sit down and write. And I don't know if I go to poems for answers as much as I go to poems for a widening of my toolbox of curiosity. You know what I mean? I am often looking for a poem that will not give me an answer, but perhaps provide me with better questions, newer questions, a more functional way to look at the world. And that might lead to some answer far, far down the road, but I don't look for an immediate answer when I'm going to poems, which doesn't mean that poems haven't provided me with some answers that I wasn't expecting. But I think it means that for me, my expectation of a poem, and when I can't broadly answer who chooses the purpose of the poem, writer or reader, but I know that when I write my poems, I am definitely choosing not to answer any questions, but or not to search for answers, but to search for better questions in my work and the work I read. I'm mostly asking to be shown something different than I knew when I sat down to read the poem. Adrian Matika has this poem called Maggot Brain. That's about Eddie Hazel, the Funkadelic guitarist. And again, when I was first getting into poems, I didn't know that anyone could write about music. You know, I didn't see a lot of poems about music in the world. And so seeing that poem about Eddie Hazel didn't answer. I already knew about Eddie Hazel. I knew more than I think most of my peers. But seeing Adrian write about Eddie Hazel in that way gave me a new way to consider grief and loss and music, and that's what I sit down to poems for. And I don't know what Adrian's purpose was, right? So I think the writer maybe determines the purpose of the poem, but once all of us choose to let go of our work and let it into the larger world, we don't really get to dictate what the work's purpose is anymore. Making peace with that is hard, but I think it's worthwhile. Sorry, I'm sifting through the poems. Do you think that writing a series of interconnected poems, or sifting through the questions, interconnected poems such as How Can Black People Write About Flowers? Oh no, where'd it go? Where'd that question go? I was reading it. Terrence is like, okay, there it is. Do you think that writing a series of interconnected poems, such as How Can Black People Write About Flowers, mirrors the theme of returning to a familiar language? I think so, yeah. So, I mean, I talk about those poems a lot, but I return to those poems because I generally, I mean, I'm going to try to limit myself, so I talk about this forever. I generally think that poets are never finished when they finish one poem. You know what I mean? I think that a lot of us are kind of like, we get to the end of the poem that expresses the idea, and we're like, cool, I'm done. You know, I did the thing. But I think that like so many of our ideas beg to be turned over. I like to think about a curiosity or an idea or a thought as something that deserves to be placed in a glass box and turned around and looked at from as many angles as possible. And for me, if I do that, multiple poems come out. Of course, there are poems in my book and in my life that are just like one shot things, but I still crave to return to those things and write more. I'm just maybe not capable yet, or I don't have the language yet. The thing with the flowers, it just so happened I had the language and the vision to pull that off at the time. But it also took a while. I mean, it took a long time to do that. And in some ways, it takes a long, the thing that took the longest for me was to humble myself and say, well, I'm not finished yet, right? And so I think not only returning to the familiar language, but learning to tell yourself that you're not finished, and learning to tell yourself that productivity in general does not necessarily align with the finishing of quote unquote work as much as it aligns with, in my opinion, the completion of a passion or a curiosity or an idea. And those two things don't always align. Have you ever read Rachel Kazi-Ganz's essay? If yes, do you hear the music in her writing? Yo, so yes, and this will give me an opportunity to tell a really beautiful story really quickly. I am a big fan of Rachel Kazi-Ganza and just have admired her work for so long, and have appreciated her for so long. And I was in this summer at the Hurston-Wright workshop at Howard. The Hurston-Wright Writers Week, Toni Morrison passed, and which was a very difficult time, but a very healing time to not only be among Black writers, but also be among Black writers at Howard. But the day after Toni Morrison passed, I had to go to I had to do some interview in DC at like the Ace Hotel or something, and I was sitting there waiting for the interviewer to arrive at the hotel restaurant, and this woman comes up to me and she's like, "Hey, are you Hanif Abdurraqib? Like, I think I've recognized you from whatever the fuck, like your work online or whatever." And I said, "Yeah." And she was like, "I'm Rachel Kazi-Ganza." And we talked we never met each other. And we talked for like an hour. And it reminded me that I don't know, I very much believe in our ancestors linking hands to bring us together even when we don't know what's happening, you know? And I felt at that week such at a loss. And to meet a living hero of mine who was a Black woman who had spent time around Miss Morrison, and the fact that we could just sit and kind of revel in our heartbreak and also an appreciation for the work that we were both attempting, felt really good. And so I think about Rachel all the time because I think that she was very much wholly sent by our ancestors to affirm our grief and our joy. How much should beginning writers and poets focus on form? Any go-to resources from writers of color? Yeah, I mean, Mess and Mess by Doug Kearney. I'll put that in the chat. Is a book that I really return to. And it's about kind of making a mess of writing and thinking about gestures and forms in writing, particularly for poets of color, particularly for Black poets. And it's a book that I return to a lot. And I don't know, for me, only think about myself in terms of how much I focused on form in the beginning, but so that's to say I didn't. And because I came up in slam, I was writing poems at first to be said out loud and not to be read on the page. And I at the time, thought that I was going to only be writing poems to be said out loud. So I didn't have much of a focus on form. But I think that as I began to consider the beauty in shape, in a poem's shape, and how much a poem's shape can determine the way a poem is read, I became really fascinated by it. And so I really liked breaking apart poems and reforming them on the page. There's also another book about form that I will send. Oh, someone put in the chat. It was Jewel Parker Rhodes' book. Yes, that is the other book I was going to return to. Those two are the ones, and I'll send that one through Hurston-Wright, and they can maybe pass it around because I want to get to a couple other questions. Let me scroll up. What is your experience as an editor? What are common mistakes you're seeing? What do you wish to see more of in submissions pitches? Well, I mean, I think a problem is, and we're talking about now editing. I edit cultural criticism, and I have a little corner in Medium, yeah, right now I think the problem is that, and this is specifically for this moment, there's just there are so many people, and the stretch of our ideas it's all pretty limited, right? And so, which is to say that we all have bad ideas. It's just that in moments we all have similar ideas. So many of us have similar ideas. And so I think running up against the wall right now is that so many folks, of course, want to pitch about our current moment, which is fine, of course, because I think it's on a lot of our minds. But I think there have been only so many ways and unique ways that I found to tell some stories through this unique moment that don't feel self-aggrandizing, or that don't feel self-congratulatory, or that don't feel like, I think there's a line between I'm living this way and it brings me joy, and like I need to write 2,000 words on the time I left New York for somewhere else, and I wouldn't call those things mistakes, because there's no mistake in thinking that our experiences are worthwhile and something that people want to read about. I don't like to think that's a mistake, and I definitely don't want to shame people for that. But I do think it's finding my way to some unique stories that, like, I think I want to read is important, especially because when I'm editing for Black writers and writers of color, right? And so, and that's only the only pictures I'm taking that I take are from Black writers, Black critics and critics of color. And so, in some ways, I was cared for a lot coming up in my early days. I was cared for a lot coming up in my early days as a writer and as a critic, because I had, Black editors who were willing to tell me, like, this isn't it. You got to do something else. And so I'm trying to extend that as well. I'm trying to extend that to folks because I think the public landscape is not generous to Black critics and Black criticism. And I've seen so many young writers, young Black writers, young writers of color get kind of tossed out there and write something that they maybe would regret in a couple weeks. But by that time, people have kind of already shut them down, and then they don't have the energy or confidence to keep it moving and move forward. And so I just really want to allow people a space where they can work through their ideas and try to pass on some of the generosity that was shown to me when I was younger. What would I say that most well-written poems have in common? Well, for me, I'm just one person with one set of tastes. And so for me, the poems that I love the most, what they have in common is that they maintain a type of skepticism or they main, you know, the singer Florence Welch has this quote where she's like, I'm deeply in love with the world, but also very afraid of it. And I think the poems I love manage to balance those two things at once. An immense love for, and I think that is also how I operate. I also move through the world with a great affection for it and a great amount of joy for living. But I'm also consistently terrified, you know? And I love a poem that balances those things. I love a poem that balances those ideas. You know, so many of the, I love the book Cruelty by the poet I. Another, you know, that book is another one of the early poetry books I got. And I'll put that in the chat as well. Although it's hard to find because it's out of print. And, you know, no judgment. I don't personally fuck with Amazon too much, but it's like the only place you can find it. Damn, I'm not even gonna put this in the chat. I mean, I'll put it in the chat, but it's hard. So it's hard to find. It's out of print. So like right now, it's $107 on Amazon. So you can get that if you want. But there's some used ones from like $23. But yeah, so Cruelty is a book of entirely persona poems that explore different modes of cruelty. And I love that book so much. I fell in love with that book at such an early point in my poetry exploration because it isn't harsh and it isn't violent necessarily, but it does approach the world with a kind of gentle skepticism, and it questions this idea. It questions this idea that people are inherently good, and I love that. I really. Oh, here I'll put. If you are like me and don't particularly fuck with Amazon, I'm gonna put the A Books link in here too, which is a little cheaper on there. You can find there's some like $24, $25 ones. It's still a very expensive book because it's just like out of print. And I don't know why someone hasn't reprinted it. My hope is one day that we'll get, you know, they just put out the Wanda Coleman collected joint. I hope that we'll get a new revised I collected joint because Cruelty is such an important book for me. And I think all the poems I love most have in common the same kind of skepticism and affection that Cruelty has, to understand that we are within touching distance at all. You know, so many of us are within touching distance of something beautiful, but even that beauty should be something we fear a little bit. I'll answer a few poems or a few more questions. What are best practices for editing your work? I believe in editing as a sonic practice. I'm someone who, I know that folks don't always like the sound of their own voices, and I don't either. But when I write a poem, perhaps this is because of my upbringing. I want to hear how it sounds out loud. I think editing is something that happens as the words fill the air. What I used to love about going to open mics a lot and going to slams a lot was that I would read my early drafts out loud, and through the reading of them on the page and reading them out loud, I would say, oh, no, that word doesn't go there. Not on stage, obviously, but in my head. As in your head, you kind of tick through these things. Like, that's not the word for there. That line isn't working. Or I repeated the word bird 4 times in a row. Or, you know, all these kind of quirks. All these kind of quirks that exist in a poem that you don't understand as you're writing it, but you hear it out loud. And so I try to keep to that tradition in my editing practice. I record myself reading my first draft and then playing back to myself. Because if I do believe in the poem as a musical arrangement, I think that the work of the poet is to be a band leader. And I think it's someone like John Coltrane, who was obviously a great musician, but also an immensely great band leader because he knew what of himself to sacrifice for the greater good of a single sound. And I think that is the work that I feel like I'm taking to as a poet. What of my skills am I going to sacrifice to make the poem work the way it needs to work? And I can't figure that out until I hear the poem out loud. And so my editing practice, and I really encourage folks to do this if they're comfortable, is to hear my work out loud, to hear it played back to me in my own voice, and to kind of struggle through edits, my first draft of edits that way. That's a big thing for me. What quality do writers / people who write have in comparison to people / writers who just talk about writing and rarely write? I mean, my thing is that if you have written or if you have thought of written, I don't personally like to think about writing as like a hierarchy based off productivity, because I think that really does all of us a disservice. You know what I mean? It does a real disservice to be like, this person writes a poem per day, so they're a poet. But this person who only wrote one poem last year is not a poet. We start thinking about writing in terms of productivity, I think we can really build some efficient bridges to each other. You know, I was talking to, I did this like in conversation thing with Ocean Vuong a few years back, and he was like, I only write like 7 poems a year. You know what I mean? And we then talked about how we kind of reframed our ideas around what productivity is. And for me, I think productivity has been anything exciting that makes a return to the page easier, even if that return to the page doesn't yield quote unquote work or something you could hand into someone at the end of it all. And so, you know, I'm down. I think about particularly folks who just did not write a lot, but who still have a lot to offer, or folks who write, you know, significantly less than I do, but still have a lot to offer. Folks who have like 1 or 2 books that I just love. Like, you know, I am always, at the very least, I'm always so thankful and grateful for anything people have to offer, and anything that people can offer me that I might not have had before. And I don't really care how much work they've quote unquote produced in order to offer me those gems, you know. Some of my earliest mentors were slam poets who didn't have a book out. And I still feel really held by those people. And it doesn't matter if they ever release a book or if they only have this one stapled together chapbook that I cherish. You know, before she had ever released anything, Dee Matthews was someone who I just learned immensely from. And that was before she had a book that I loved. And so I do think that, I mean, I actually talked about this at Hurston-Wright Writers Week, and I felt bad because I felt like I like hijacked the last moment of my like workshop there. But I think as writers, it's important to detach ourselves from these capitalist notions of productivity, because I don't think they serve the work. Like, I don't think they serve our ability to be inventive and to be exciting and to challenge the world, if we only think about ourselves as vessels to produce for the end result of someone else. And so I really think it's important to detach ourselves from that. And I know that didn't answer the question wholly, but I tried. I'm sorry. Can I do 1 or 2 more? Or maybe 1 more? I know that I'm a little over time, but I do want to get to questions and make people feel like they're heard. Have you ever, or do you write songs? Yeah, so I did. Yeah, I did write. I was in a band for a bit. A thing that I feel like people don't know about me a lot, although maybe they do, is that I was in conservatory. I was in after in my like early 20s, I went to a music conservatory, and I studied songwriting, and I studied musical arrangements, and I studied piano, and I was in a band briefly, and I was their chief songwriter and keyboardist, and we were not very good. I was not very good. We broke up in the midpoint of our first show. We broke up because our bassist quit, which led for our drummer to quit, and then it was just me and our lead singer on the stage. And so I do write songs. I haven't written songs in a while. I collaborated with a couple musicians on some lyrics last year, and it felt very good. It felt very good to tap back into that part of myself, and remind myself that, again, if we're talking about like productivity and creativity and the things that we do for ourselves versus the things that we do for others, it was so great for me to tap back into writing lyrics and writing music with people with no expectation of those songs ever coming out, just doing it and reminding myself of the musicality of language. And so I do write songs. I will probably not be writing many songs again. And that's probably that. last one, best storyteller in hip hop, in my opinion, is probably from a linear narrative standpoint. So the best storyteller in hip hop, in my opinion, I have two. So I have three. One, I do think I think MC Light is really one of them, and I think MC Light does not get talked about as a storyteller often. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but some of them are the obvious ones you're likely thinking of. But I also think it's because people did not, or I think her mode of storytelling is so casual. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean, I think her mode of storytelling is so casually delivered that it feels warm and perhaps not surprising to folks. But so MC Light is one. I still say Slick Rick. And I like to think about reliable narrators and unreliable narrators. And so I think Slick Rick is one of hip hop's great reliable narrators. But the great unreliable narrator in hip hop is Ghostface, I think. I think about Ghostface all the time as such a brilliant storyteller because his narration is so unreliable and yet you know what's happening. I think about the song 260. I understand what's happening, but his telling of it is so all over the place. And Ghostface is often using the metaphor and narrative tricks. And so I personally love an unreliable narrator myself in a poem and in a song. I think about poets like Kaveh Akbar, like how Kaveh is such a brilliant, unreliable narrator in his work, where I know what's happening in his poems, but they are so all over the place that it creates a mess of the narrative, even though you're still kind of being guided through the house. So, for example, I feel like the difference between a reliable and unreliable narrator is that a reliable narrator will take you on a home tour and show you the living room, or a reliable narrator will take you on that home tour and show you the living room first. From the living room, you go into the kitchen. From the kitchen, you go into the like dining room type shit. An unreliable narrator will be like, no, we're gonna go to the attic, and then we're gonna go down to the basement, and then we're gonna go to the backyard. So the moving parts of the story are where the mess is made. But even through that messiness, you still know what's happening. You still know that you're being shown a house. And so I love Kaveh Akbar for that. I think a poet who is a great reliable narrator is Khadijah Queen. Khadijah Queen who sustains effective narratives not just through poems but through an entire book, through, in my opinion, an entire body of work, like an entire arc of work. And I think Khadijah Queen is just one of the great, consistent, reliable narrators in poetry history. Like no lie, like through the history of poems, she is, for me, that's just like an icon in that regard. And so I know this is about storytellers in hip hop, but I see these modes in poems too. I mentioned Adrian Matika, and I think he's just a brilliant, reliable narrator. Whereas I think of Ross Gay, who leans on a lot of unreliability to build up an emotional, unexpected turn, who relies on like voltas built through unreliability. And so those are folks I'm thinking about. I guess I should probably jump off here because I don't want to keep the Hurston-Wright folks, but I really appreciate these questions, and I really appreciate y'all spending time with me today. And I hope this was at least somewhat exciting. Hey.
Thank you, Hanif. I think it was more than exciting. I think you were very generous. This was phenomenal. So, y'all in the chat box, to just say thank you to Hanif, can you type one thing that you're going to take away from his talk today? Um, but y'all are saying thank you. So listen, we really appreciate your time. Hanif is an excellent instructor. He reminds me of like my favorite HBCU professor, mixed with a little bit of Mark Anthony Neal, with all of his astute understanding of music and history. This was meant to be a really short micro class. We're very blessed to have had Hanif. He was very generous and gave us more of his time. Help us think about other ways that we can support Black writers and readers. We welcome your thoughts at the foundation. We're looking towards, what this next year and what what the new way of working might be for us. We normally host our workshops in person at Howard University, as Hanif has mentioned, and some of our friends, Mississippi, Roderick, Tina, and Camille, other folks in the chat box. But we may be doing more virtual things. So we would love to get your feedback. If you enjoyed this session, please also join us tomorrow, same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, for the session titled A Mic Drop or a Graceful Bow with Shayla Sabri. You may know her as she was nominated for NAACP Image Award for her collection Mistress. And we'll put the link to register in the chat box. The other thing is, if you don't own any of Hanif's books, I really encourage you to click the button below my face, the green button, and support Hanif, and also support one of our locally indie Black-owned bookstores. And if the book that you're looking for Hanif isn't here, I also encourage you to perhaps go to your own local indie bookstore, woman-owned, minority-owned, and support them. As you know, lots of literary organizations and books and publishers, bookstores and publishers, we're all having a challenging time right now. And then finally, I encourage you all to learn more about the foundation, join our email list, follow us on social media. You'll learn more about our upcoming workshops and how we are adjusting and thinking about retooling as we all, muster through this, the COVID-19 pandemic. Our June Writers Week workshop will actually take place virtually. So if any of you are writers, we still are accepting some applications for the nonfiction workshop. And we're also accepting applications for August Writers Week, which will include Shayla Sabri on poetry, Emily Bernard for nonfiction, and Dolan Perkins Valdez for fiction. We have a dynamic roster of instructors for both our June workshops and August workshops. So I really encourage you to take a look. And then finally, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here from all over the world. I saw the Netherlands. I saw Iowa. I saw many places. So thank you for spending a little bit of your afternoon with us. And I really hope to see you tomorrow. Again, you can follow our link, learn more about the foundation. You can also make a donation if you're so inclined. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow with Shayla Sabri. Have a great evening or afternoon or morning, everyone. Bye.